So if you've ever wanted to attempt long exposure photography with your GoPro, today's video is for you. In this video, I'll show you everything you need to know to get some spectacular long exposure photos with your GoPro. All you will need, other than your GoPro and a tripod, is a $20 ND filter. The specific filter that I use is the Freewell Long Exposure ND1000. The ND1000 filter provides the equivalence of 10 f-stops. This ND1000 filter right here only allows 1/1000th of the ambient light into the GoPro sensor. So the ND1000 does a serious job with filtering out that light, and that is necessary in order to get quality long exposure photographs with your GoPro. All of the photographs I'm going to show you in this video today are photographs that I took on the GoPro Hero 10 using this exact ND1000 filter. But these steps I'm providing today should be possible on any GoPro that's the Hero 5 Black or newer. But it is worth noting you will need a different filter than the one that I have here if you're using anything other than a Hero 9 or Hero 10 Black. In the description below, I've linked to the filter you'll need based on the GoPro model that you own. So let's dive in and take a look, and I'm gonna give you all of the settings and tools that you need in order to capture amazing long exposure photography with your GoPro. All right, so first thing we need to do here is take off the GoPro lens cover and put on the ND filter. So to take off this lens cover, it's real simple. You just need to pull out and twist. It's gonna pull off just like that. And then to put the ND filter back on, you're just gonna start this off diagonally here. And then you're going to twist to the right. And you'll know it's on when it locks into place and when you see a nice tight seal around here. There should not be a gap and it should not be uneven here. Which this is a good time to say, the ND filters do not make your GoPro waterproof. So if you have ND filters on, do not take your GoPro under water or submerge it in water because it could ruin your camera. That being said, these do have a pretty tight seal. And if you happen to get in rain or snow with these, your GoPro should be fine. I used mine in rain today, in fact, and it was fine, no problems. Which is especially important if you're taking pictures at waterfalls or streams. It's possible your GoPro could get splattered, but definitely make sure your GoPro does not fall into the water, as there's no guarantee it's going to be waterproof. So I would label it as water resistant with the ND filter, but not waterproof. All right, so now that the ND filter's on, we're gonna go through the settings that you need to configure on your GoPro for long exposure photography. You will note that with the ND filter on, you really cannot see any light through there. It truly is 1/1000th of the light. And even when you're outside on a bright day, things are still gonna look pretty dark in your display. So I do recommend using your phone if you have the Quick app installed for taking the photos. It's not necessary, but it does help. And I definitely recommend that so you can see a preview of what your photo looks like after you take it, so you can make sure that it's got the lighting that you want. So the first thing you need to do here is you need to go to photo mode. And when you get to photo mode, on the Hero 10 at least, you're going to see a mode called night photo. And when you get to the night photo, you'll want to make sure you go into the settings on that. In the case of the Hero 10, we're gonna click the edit button right here to the right. All right, when you get into this, for the output, make sure the output is set to RAW. Now, whether you want to extensively edit those photos or not, you want to have RAW here because you'll get a RAW and JPEG. And that way you have those RAW photos in case you want to edit them later on. The RAW photo is going to store a lot more detail, so when you edit later on, you're going to be able to bring out a lot of that detail that you otherwise would not be able to do in a JPEG. And that is especially important for long exposure photography. So I highly recommend using the output of RAW. Now you'll see right here, I have my shutter set to 20 seconds. The shutter speed is how we get our long exposure photography, because on the GoPro, the aperture is set to 2.8. You can't change that. It's a default of 2.8. In addition, we're going to have our ISO set to a value that also cannot be changed. So the shutter is the variable that matters. Now with the ND1000 filter, when we have our ISO set to a static value and we have our aperture of 2.8, this is going to force the GoPro to slow down that shutter speed in order to properly expose the photo. So if you were in a bright lighting situation, which in a lot of situations you probably will be with long exposure photography, let's say if you're shooting a waterfall and it's the middle of the day and it's sunny, or if you're at the ocean and you're getting waves as they go around the rocks, you're gonna wanna set this to auto. Auto shutter is generally going to give you about 1 to 2 seconds there if it's a bright day. the camera is going to auto do the 1 to 2 seconds. You're not going to have to do that. But if you're in the woods or in the shade, the auto shutter may not do what you want it to do. So I've experimented a lot with this to get you the very best settings. And what I've noticed is if I'm in the shade, the auto shutter may default to about 10 seconds, but those photos are still dark. They're too dark. So the nice thing about being in the shade or on a particularly dark or overcast day is you can up the shutter. You can go up to 15 seconds, 20 seconds, maybe even 30. So this photo right here, I shot with 30 seconds today, and it looks great. 30 seconds was needed. The camera was defaulting to about 10 seconds, and that wasn't quite enough. But it is important to note that with raw photos, oftentimes it's going to look dark until you bring out the details when you use an ND filter like this. So don't despair if you're using raw and your photos are quite dark looking. But at the same time, if your photo is dark, I encourage you to up that shutter speed all the way up to 30 seconds and take a couple photos with that as well. That way, in case it is super dark, you're gonna have the 30-second max shutter speed allowed in this. So if it's really bright, put it at auto. And if you're in the shade or it's a dark, cloudy day, then you may have some flexibility to go up to 10 seconds or higher. Other than that, I do recommend setting the timer to 3 seconds. And the reason for that is you want to have your GoPro really still. You don't want there to be any movement in your GoPro. Otherwise, your long exposure photograph is going to be blurry with a jittery appearance and unusable. Because in long exposure photography, the only thing you want to have that motion blur to it is something that's moving in it, which generally is going to be water or clouds or the ocean, something like that. But you want everything else that's stationary to be stationary, which is why you want to have your GoPro on a tripod. It doesn't have to be a fancy tripod, it just needs to be a tripod that'll keep it still without it moving. But when you set this to 3 seconds, you're able to push this, and then there's 3 seconds before the photograph actually takes. You also, of course, can use the Quick app to take the photo. You can push the button on there. You can also use the GoPro remote. So you don't have to do the 3 seconds, but even if I'm using the remote, I like to keep it set to 3 seconds in case I physically push the button. It's good to have it set to 3. For the ProTune settings, EV comp, keep that at 0. We don't want to mess with the exposure on this with the ND filter. For the white balance, if it's normal daytime lighting, I recommend setting that to 5000 or 5500K. If you are shooting long exposure photography at sunrise or sunset, set this to 6500K. It's going to look extra good. Of course, you can change this variable later on when editing, but it makes it easier if you set the white balance for your lighting when you're doing the photo. For the ISO min, set that to 100, and for the ISO max, set that to 100 as well. My personal preference is sharpness of low, because I can always add sharpness later on when editing, and I like to put the color to flat. That way I can add the saturation that I want later on when editing. If you don't want sharpness of low, you can go at most to medium, but I don't recommend going to high. It's too much sharpness. And it's harder to take that sharpness away when editing than it is to add some sharpness. If you do want a photograph where you don't want to do any editing for the color on it, then you can put the color to natural or vibrant. If you're using an older GoPro, the color is going to be called GoPro on it. Then the shortcuts down here, these do not apply. So those are all the settings and tools that you'll need in order to get a quality long exposure photograph with your GoPro. I hope you found this tutorial to be helpful, and until we talk again, happy GoProing.